right, everyone, welcome back. We're doing a deep dive today on a case that really shows how strong local laws can be.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
It's all about this legal fight between Pakistan International Airlines. Most people just call them PIA, and two Filipino flight attendants. But we're talking a Supreme Court decision here, so, things got pretty intense.
Yeah, it went all the way to the top.
What's so interesting, though, is how a basic employment contract ended up clashing with Philippine law and how much it tries to protect workers.
It's a great example of how, legal systems, they try to balance things. The idea that you can agree to whatever you want in a contract, but also that employees need some protection.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
So let's get this story started. We've got PIA, this big international airline, and these two flight attendants, Ethelyn Ferrales and Maria Mamaseg, they signed this 3-year contract with PIA. They'd be based in Manila but flying all over the world.
Sounds like a pretty sweet dig.
Right.
Yeah.
But you said things aren't always what they seem, so what was wrong with this contract?
Well, a couple things in there kind of raised some red flags. First, you've got the 3-year limit, which is normal for these fixed-term contracts. But then they had this other part that said PIA could end the whole thing with just 1 month's notice. Or they could just pay the attendants for that month and let them go.
Wait a minute. 1 month's notice after they've committed to 3 years? That doesn't seem right.
And that's exactly what Philippine labor law is designed to stop. They don't just let you fire someone because it's in the contract. There are rules about it. It's all to keep people from being treated unfairly.
So even if you have a contract, there's this extra level of protection for workers in the Philippines.
Exactly. It's like a safety net. So you can't just be tossed out of a job for no reason. This is where you get that idea of security of tenure.
Security of tenure. Sounds pretty important.
It is, and it's right there in Articles 280 and 281 of the Philippine Labor Code. What they basically say is even if you have a contract for a set time after you've worked there a while, you get more rights as an employee. You can't just be fired without a good reason.
This whole contract thing took a turn, though, when PIA fired both flight attendants after only like a year and a half.
Right around there, yeah.
So they just accepted that.
Oh, no, they fought back. In their case, it went all the way to the Philippine Supreme Court.
That's where things get really interesting. Did the court just say the contract was valid? Or did they consider those Philippine labor laws we were talking about?
That's the big question. And what the court decided is super important. It shows how Philippine law really tries to protect employees, even when there are these fixed-term contracts.
All right, I'm hooked. What happened?
Well, the court sided with the flight attendants. They said they were illegally fired, but their reasoning, that's the fascinating part.
Tell me, why did the court go against PIA?
Basically, they said that part of the contract, the one where PIA could end things with a month's notice, that kind of negated the whole 3-year fixed term. It made it look like the flight attendants were employed at the pleasure of PIA, which goes totally against that security of tenure idea.
So the contract was trying to have it both ways. A fixed term to sound good, but an easy way out if they wanted to get rid of someone.
The court saw it that way, for sure. They said it was a sneaky way to get around Philippine law, which is all about keeping employees from getting fired for no good reason.
That makes you think about how much power each side has in these contracts. But before we go there, let's make sure everyone's clear on these fixed-term contracts. Are all fixed-term contracts a problem?
That's a good question. And it leads to this really important case called Brent School case. What they decided there was that not all fixed-term contracts are bad. There has to be a real reason for setting a fixed time, not just a way to mess over employees.
So there are good reasons for fixed-term contracts, but the court in this PIA case saw right through that.
Absolutely. They knew what PIA was trying to do. And to make it even clearer, they ordered PIA to give the flight attendants their jobs back and depay them for the time they missed.
Wow. Talk about sticking up for the little guy. But I'm still curious about one thing. PIA is a huge international airline. Couldn't they argue that some other countries' laws should apply?
Oh, they definitely tried that.
Really?
Yeah, PIA said Pakistani law should be the one that counts, and any argument should be settled over in Pakistan. It's like they're saying different country, different rules.
Did that work?
Not at all.
Come on, tell me why. What did the court say about that?
The Philippine Supreme Court said this whole case was way too connected to the Philippines. The contract was signed here. Some of the work happened here. The flight attendants were Filipino. And PIA was officially allowed to operate in the Philippines. It wasn't just some random thing. They had a real presence here.
So no escaping Philippine law, even for a giant airline. This is where it gets interesting for everyone listening. Even if you're working for a company in another country, where you actually work, and what your nationality is, those can really affect your rights.
That's so important. Contracts don't exist in a vacuum, you know? They have to follow the laws of the place where they're happening. And in this case, the Philippines was very serious about protecting its workers.
What a decision. Okay, I need a minute to think about all this, but before we do, let's break down this whole jurisdiction thing. Why did the Philippine court even have the power to decide this? Couldn't PIA just tell them to back off and say it was a Pakistani problem?
That's where it gets a bit technical, but I'll keep it simple. Jurisdiction. It basically means whether a court has the authority to make a decision on a case. In this situation, the Philippine Supreme Court looked at a bunch of things that tied the case to the Philippines. Like we said, the contract was signed here, some of the work was done here, the flight attendants were Filipino, and PIA was doing business right here in the Philippines.
So it wasn't just about what the contract said, it was about what was actually happening and who it was affecting.
Exactly. The court understood that it had to step in to protect its own citizens and its own laws.
Makes sense. It wasn't just some theoretical thing. It was about real people and their rights.
Absolutely. And that brings up a bigger question. What does this case tell us about the balance of power, between employers and employees, especially when you're talking about different countries?
That's what I was just thinking about. It goes beyond the legal stuff. It makes you wonder what would have happened if this went down today with how globalized everything is. Do those lines between different countries' laws, are they getting blurrier?
They definitely are. And that's why this case from all the way back in 1990, it's still so relevant. It shows the challenges you get when you try to balance two things: contract law, which is all about freedom to choose, and labor law, which is all about protecting workers.
It's like this back and forth between those two legal ideas.
Yeah.
And then you throw in working across different countries, and it gets even more complicated.
Exactly. Think about it. You could have a contract that says it follows the laws of one country, but the work is happening in another country, and the employee is from a third country. That's just asking for trouble.
My head's spinning. So how do we even start to figure out this mess of laws and which court should decide?
I think the PIA case gives us some clues. Remember how the Philippine Supreme Court focused on the real-world stuff? They looked at where the contract was signed, where the work happened, the nationalities, and whether PIA was actually allowed to operate in the Philippines.
So it's not just about the words in the contract. It's about the reality of the situation and who it impacts.
That's a key takeaway. And it's becoming even more important now, because the lines are blurring between physical workplaces and doing things online. Think about it. What if you're working remotely for a company in another country? Whose laws apply then? Where do you go if there's a problem? These are the kinds of questions courts are dealing with more and more these days.
Feels like the legal system is trying to play catch-up with all the technology and globalization. But what about those international agreements and groups we hear about? Aren't they supposed to be making some kind of worldwide rules for labor rights?
For sure. There are groups working to even out those labor standards and come up with ways to solve these cross-border disagreements, like the International Labor Organization, the ILO.
Okay, I've heard of the ILO, but I got to be honest, I don't
Yeah.
really know what they do. What's their deal?
The ILO, they've been around for over 100 years, and they've done a lot to set those international labor standards and make sure everyone has decent work. They put together these agreements on all kinds of employment stuff, things like how to fire people fairly, discrimination, and the right to form unions.
So like the United Nations, but for labor rights.
Yeah.
But do they actually have any power? Can they force companies to follow these agreements?
That's a great question. It goes to the heart of how international law actually works. The ILO, their main job is to set the standards and give advice, but they can't really enforce things like a national court can.
So they can't just go after companies that break the rules.
Not exactly. But their agreements, they can have a big impact. A lot of countries take those ILO standards and make them part of their own laws, and the ILO can put pressure on governments to stick to what they agreed to.
So they set the bar high and encourage countries to do the right thing. But do companies even care about these international standards if they don't have to legally?
That's where things get interesting. You see more and more people caring about corporate social responsibility. Consumers and investors, they're demanding that companies act ethically and respect workers, even if they're not legally required to.
So it's not just governments and international groups anymore. Regular people and investors are using their influence to make a difference.
Exactly. And that's why I think this PIA case was ahead of its time. Even though it happened before all these ideas were popular, it shows how important it is to hold companies accountable, even big multinational ones, for how they treat their employees.
It's a reminder that globalization shouldn't just be about profits and efficiency. It should also be about being fair and treating people right.
Well said. And that takes us back to that core issue, the balance of power between employers and employees. The PIA case proves that even in today's interconnected world, local laws, especially those protecting basic rights, they can still have a huge impact.
It's good to know that people, even when they're going up against these big corporations, they can still get justice and protection under their own country's laws.
Absolutely. Cases like this are so important. They set examples, they get people talking, and they inspire us to keep fighting for a world where workers' rights are respected everywhere, no matter where you work or who you work for.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation. We've gone over so much from the details of this case to what it all means for the future of work. But before we wrap things up, there's one more important piece I want to touch on.
Oh, I'm all ears. What's on your mind?
We've talked about the legal stuff, different countries' laws and international standards. But there's another powerful force at play here that we shouldn't forget about.
You got me hooked. Tell me more.
It's the power of individual action and workers coming together. Remember, those flight attendants didn't just give up. They fought back, they got organized, and they won.
Such a good point. Their story shows how strong it can be when workers unite, to demand fair treatment and make their employers answer for their actions.
And it's not just individual cases. It's a whole movement for workers' rights. Unions, advocacy groups, even online communities. They're all raising awareness, sharing info, and supporting workers who are struggling.
You're absolutely right. The way we work is changing so fast. And it's more important than ever for workers to have a say to know their rights and have access to help when they need it.
It's like we're all in this together, trying to figure out this new world of work. And we need to support each other, share what we know, and fight for a future where everyone can succeed.
Well said. The PIA case might be from decades ago, but what it teaches us about worker empowerment, the importance of legal protection, and the fight for fairness and justice at work, it's all more relevant than ever.
This deep dive has given us so much to think about. I'm sure our listeners have tons of questions and ideas of their own. But before we get to those, let's take a quick break to collect our thoughts and get ready for the final part of our exploration.
We'll be right back to dig even deeper into what this case means for the future of work and discuss what each of us can do to build a fairer and more just global economy. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back, everyone. I think it's really worth taking a second here to appreciate what the Philippine Supreme Court did in this case. They didn't just follow the contract blindly. They looked at the bigger picture, the possibility of workers being taken advantage of, and how important it is to protect their rights.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It reminds us that the law isn't just words on paper. It's about making sure things are fair and just out there in the real world.
Exactly. And that leads us to what you were asking about before the break. How might this case have gone differently in today's globalized world?
It's a whole different game now with remote work, international teams, and companies operating across so many borders. It makes you wonder, are those lines about which country's laws apply, are they getting more blurred?
Definitely. And that's why this case from way back in 1990 is still relevant today. It shows the tough questions that come up when you try to balance contract law, which is often about freedom of choice, with labor law, which is all about protecting employees.
It's like this constant tug of war between those two legal ideas. And then you throw in the international aspect and it gets even more tangled.
Exactly. Imagine this. You've got a contract that says it's governed by one country's laws, but the work's actually being done in a different country. And the employee is a citizen of yet another country. It's like a recipe for conflict.
Whoa, my head's spinning just thinking about it. So how do we even begin to sort out this mess?
Well, the PIA case gives us some hints. Remember how the Philippine Supreme Court focused on real-world connections? They looked at where the contract was signed, where the work was done, nationalities, and whether PIA was operating legally in the Philippines.
So it's not just about what's written in the contract. It's about the actual situation and who it affects.
That's a crucial point. And it's becoming even more important now, with physical workplaces and online spaces becoming more and more blended. Imagine you're working remotely for a company in another country. Whose laws are in charge then? Where do you go if a problem pops up? These are the kinds of questions courts are wrestling with all the time now.
It's like the legal system is trying to catch up with how fast technology and globalization are moving. But what about all those international agreements and organizations we hear about? Don't they create some kind of global framework for worker rights?
They do. The International Labor Organization, for example, the ILO.
Okay, I've heard of them, but I got to be honest, I don't really know what they do. What's the deal with the ILO?
The ILO has been around for over a century. And they've been super important in setting international labor standards and promoting decent working conditions for everyone. They create conventions on all sorts of employment issues, like how to fire someone fairly, preventing discrimination, and the right for workers to form unions.
So they're like the United Nations, but for labor rights. But do they have any real power? Can they actually enforce those conventions and make countries follow them?
That's a good question, and it gets to the core of how international law works. The ILO's main role is to set standards and provide guidance, but they don't have the power to directly enforce those standards like a national court would.
So they can't just punish companies that ignore their conventions?
Not directly, but those conventions can be really influential. Many countries integrate ILO standards into their own laws, and the ILO can put pressure on governments to live up to the agreements they've made.
So it's more about setting a high standard and encouraging countries to meet it. But it makes you wonder, do companies even care about these international standards if they're not legally binding?
That's where things get interesting. There's a growing movement focused on corporate social responsibility. Consumers and investors are starting to demand that companies behave ethically and respect workers' rights, even if it's not legally required.
So it's not just governments and international organizations anymore. Regular people and investors are using their power to push for positive change.
Exactly. And that's why this PIA case from way back when can be seen as a sort of early example of that. Even though it was decided before these ideas became mainstream, it shows how crucial it is to hold companies accountable for how they treat their workers, even massive multinational corporations.
It's a reminder that globalization shouldn't just be about profits and efficiency. It should also be about fairness and basic human rights.
Well said. And it brings us right back to that fundamental question, the balance of power between employers and employees. The PIA case shows that even in our increasingly interconnected world, local laws, especially those that protect fundamental rights, can still have a huge impact.
It's empowering to know that individuals, even when they're facing off against these huge corporations, can still seek justice and protection under their own country's laws.
Absolutely. Cases like this are so important. They set precedents, raise awareness, and inspire us to keep pushing for a world where workers' rights are respected everywhere, regardless of where they work or who they work for.
This has been such a thought-provoking discussion. We've covered so much ground, from the specific details of this fascinating case to the bigger picture of what it means for the future of work. But before we wrap things up, there's one last critical element I want to touch on.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's on your mind?
We've talked about legal frameworks, jurisdiction, and international standards. But there's another powerful force at play here that we shouldn't underestimate.
You've got me intrigued. Tell me more.
It's the power of individual action and collective bargaining.
Remember.
Those flight attendants didn't just sit back and accept their fate. They fought back, they organized, and ultimately they won their case.
That's such an important point. Their story is a testament to the power of workers coming together to demand fair treatment and hold their employers accountable.
And it's not just about individual cases. It's about the broader movement for workers' rights. Unions, worker advocacy groups, even online communities are playing a vital role in raising awareness, sharing information, and supporting workers who are facing challenges.
You're absolutely right. The world of work is changing rapidly, and it's more crucial than ever for workers to have a voice, to know their rights, and to have access to resources and support when they need it.
It's like we're all in this together, navigating this new world of work. And we need to support each other, share knowledge, and fight for a future where everyone can thrive.
Beautifully said. The PIA case may have been decided decades ago, but its lessons about worker empowerment, the importance of legal protections, and the ongoing struggle for fairness and justice in the workplace are more relevant than ever.
This deep dive has given us so much to think about, and I'm sure our listeners are buzzing with questions and insights of their own. But before we get to those, let's take a quick break to gather our thoughts and get ready for the final part of our exploration.
We'll be right back to delve deeper into the implications of this case for the future of work and discuss what each of us can do to contribute to a more just and equitable global economy. Stay tuned.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into this whole world of international employment contracts and how Philippine law handles things. You know, we've talked about a lot, but this is where I think it gets really interesting. We're going to shift gears from looking back at this case to looking ahead. What can we learn from this whole PIA situation that can help us navigate the future of work?
You know, you brought up a good point earlier about the power of people coming together. It's easy to feel small when you're going up against a big company, But that PIA case, it shows us that individuals can make a difference, especially when they join forces.
Right. It's like that saying strength in numbers. But it's more than just joining a union or signing something.
Mhm.
It's about knowing your rights and speaking up when things aren't right.
Definitely. Knowledge is power. And these days, information is everywhere. We've got websites, groups dedicated to helping workers, even social media, where people can connect and share their stories and learn from each other.
It's like this global support system for workers,
Yeah.
which is pretty amazing when you think about it. But what about those of us who aren't part of a union or anything official? What can we do as individuals to make a difference?
There are so many ways to get involved, even in small ways. You can start by just learning about labor rights yourself and telling others about them. You can support businesses that treat their employees well. You can even write to your elected officials and push for policies that protect workers. And don't be afraid to speak out against injustice, whether it's happening where you work or across the world.
Those are all great ideas. It's empowering to know that we don't have to just accept things the way they are. We can actually help shape a better future for workers. But what about technology in all this? On one hand, it's opening up all these opportunities for remote work and collaborating across borders. But on the other hand, it's causing concerns about worker exploitation and whether traditional labor protections are fading away.
It's definitely a double-edged sword. Technology is changing the workplace faster than ever, and the laws are having trouble keeping up. We need to figure out how to use technology for good while also dealing with the potential downsides.
Yeah, that's the tough part, isn't it? How do we balance progress with protecting workers? I mean, we can't just stop technology from advancing, but we can't let workers' rights get left behind either.
It's complicated and there's no easy solution, but that PIA case might have some clues. Remember how the court focused on real-world connections even though it was an international company? They looked at where the work was done, where the employees lived, and if the company was operating legally in the Philippines. That idea of basing legal decisions on the reality of people's lives, it's going to be even more important as work becomes more virtual and spread out.
So even if your office is just your laptop and a Wi-Fi connection, your physical location and the laws of that place still matter. It's not like we're in some kind of lawless digital Wild West.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand the laws that apply to you specifically, even if you're working remotely for a company in another country. Don't assume that just because something is online or happening across borders, it's automatically exempt from the law.
It's like those old pirate movies where they'd say there's no king on these seas. Well, in the digital world, there might not be a king, but there are definitely laws, and they're always changing.
That's a great way to put it. And it shows why we need to stay flexible and proactive. We need to be ready to learn, ask questions, and stand up for ourselves and each other as the way we work keeps evolving.
It's like we're all explorers sailing into uncharted territory, and we need to have the knowledge, the tools, and the courage to navigate these new challenges and create a future of work that works for everyone.
Well said. That's a perfect way to wrap things up, I think. That PIA case reminds us that even in a globalized world, local laws and individual actions can make a real difference. It inspires us to stay informed, to connect with others, and to keep fighting for a future of work that's fair, just, and equitable for everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into international employment contracts and Philippine labor law. We hope you found it as interesting as we did. Remember, knowledge is power, and together we can create a world where every worker is treated with dignity and respect. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep fighting the good fight.